When I first moved into my new apartment, the first thing I noticed was how thin the walls were. I could hear everything. The muffled hum of my neighbor's TV, footsteps above me, and the occasional sound of furniture being dragged. It wasn't ideal, but it was affordable, and I figured I'd get used to it. About a week after I settled in, I started hearing a strange tapping noise coming from the unit next door. It wasn't rhythmic, like someone hammering or fixing something. It was irregular. 3 quick taps, a pause, then 2 taps. It would go on for hours, usually late at night. At first, I assumed it was someone working on a project or a pet scratching at something. But after a few days, it became clear the tapping wasn't coming from the floor or ceiling. It was coming from the shared wall. I told myself it was nothing to worry about. Maybe my neighbor was redecorating or had a leaky pipe. But when I asked around, other tenants said the unit next to mine was empty. That gave me pause. I brushed it off as a mistake. Maybe the landlord hadn't updated them yet, but the tapping continued, growing louder each night. One evening, I decided to knock back on the wall. I wanted to let them know I could hear them, hoping they'd stop. Almost immediately, I got a response. 3 taps, matching the rhythm I'd heard before. My stomach tightened. I tried to reason it away. Maybe someone had moved in recently and hadn't told anyone. Or maybe it was a harmless coincidence, some kind of pipe or heating system acting up. But that explanation felt weak when I realized the tapping always stopped when I moved closer to the wall. I brought it up to the landlord, who confirmed the unit next door was still vacant. He said he'd check it out, but I never heard back from him. That night, the tapping got worse. It wasn't just taps now. It was scratching, faint but persistent, like nails dragging along the other side of the wall. I barely slept, and the next morning, I noticed something odd. A faint, reddish streak running down the corner of the shared wall. It looked like rust, but there wasn't any piping there. I scrubbed at it, but it didn't budge. The final straw came a few nights later. I woke up to a loud thud, followed by frantic tapping, faster and more desperate than before. It sounded like someone, or something, was trying to get through the wall. I left my apartment that night and stayed at a friend's place. The landlord called me a few days later. He said he'd gone into the unit and found nothing unusual. He suggested I was hearing noises from the building settling or animals in the walls. I never moved back there. I moved into my duplex in early spring. My new neighbor, Mrs. Green, was polite but distant. She was in her 60s, lived alone, and spent most of her time tending to her garden. She didn't seem like the type to cause any trouble, so I was happy to have a quiet neighbor. Her garden was immaculate, with hedges perfectly trimmed. She didn't talk much, but her calm, measured demeanor made me think of her as a harmless older woman who valued her privacy. Still, one thing about her house stood out. Every window was spotless, with flower pots and curtains that matched her meticulous personality, except for one. There was a single window where the curtains were drawn tight, day and night. The rest of her home looked bright and welcoming, but that one window always sat in shadow. At first, I brushed it off. Everyone has a room they don't use or keep messy. But the more I noticed it, the more it unsettled me. The feeling only grew stronger when I started hearing noises. It began late at night, usually around 2 a.m., a faint, rhythmic thumping, like something hitting the floor. At first, I thought it might be her dropping something or moving furniture, but it was too consistent. It always came from the same direction, the wall that separated my bedroom from her side of the duplex. The noises weren't loud enough to wake me, but once I noticed them, I couldn't ignore them. I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint, hollow sound. It wasn't every night, but when it happened, it was always the same. One evening, as I lay in bed trying to read, I overheard her voice. It was muffled, low, and strained, like she was arguing with someone. I couldn't make out the words, but it was strange because I'd never seen anyone visit her house. Not once. The next day I ran into her while taking out the trash. She gave me a polite nod and I decided to ask her directly. I made small talk, casually mentioning I'd heard voices the night before and wondering if she'd had company over. She stopped, her hand gripping the trash bag tightly, and gave me a long, measured look.
Oh, I live alone.
Her tone calm but clipped. Then she smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes, and excused herself, walking back to her house without another word. That night, the noises got worse. It wasn't just the thumping anymore. It was a dragging sound, heavy and deliberate, like someone moving something large across the floor. I pressed my ear to the wall, but it was hard to tell what was happening. The sound seemed to move, like it was coming from different parts of the house. A few days later, I noticed her garden hose running, flooding a corner of her yard. I knocked on her door to let her know, but she didn't answer. Her car was in the driveway, so I assumed she was home. Out of curiosity, I walked around the side of her house and glanced through one of the windows. Through a crack in the curtains, I saw her standing in that locked room. She wasn't alone. Someone else, a man, was in there, slumped in a chair. His head hung at an odd angle, and he didn't move. Mrs. Green was leaning over him, her face inches from his, her lips moving as though she were whispering something. I stepped back quickly, my heart pounding. I nearly tripped over the garden hose as I hurried back to my own house. My mind raced with questions. Who was that man? Why had I never seen him before? Was he hurt? That night, I called the police and asked for a welfare check. I told them about the noises, the man I'd seen in her house, and my growing concerns. They arrived within 20 minutes, their flashlights cutting through the dark as they knocked on her door. After a few minutes, Mrs. Green answered. I watched from my window as she stood in the doorway, calm and composed, talking to the officers. After a while, they left. One of them stopped by my house to let me know they'd found nothing unusual. Mrs. Green had explained that the noises were from an old radiator, and the man I'd seen was a mannequin she used for her sewing projects. After that, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I left my house, I felt her eyes on me. Even when I wasn't near a window, I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see her standing there, watching. I moved out a year later. I didn't tell her I was leaving. I didn't even say goodbye. Weeks after I left, I checked the local news out of curiosity. There was nothing. No arrests, no investigations, no missing persons reports. Just silence. To this day, I wonder what I really saw in that room. The man slumped in the chair, the way Mrs. Green leaned over him, and the faint smirk she wore when she caught me staring. I try to forget, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear that faint, rhythmic thumping in my dreams. When I moved into the townhouse, I was excited about the neighborhood. It was a quiet, suburban area with well-kept lawns and rows of similar-looking homes, the kind of place where you'd expect to find kids playing on the sidewalks and retirees pruning their rose bushes. It was peaceful and ordinary, exactly what I needed after a stressful move. The house I rented was part of a long strip of townhouses, each separated by a narrow driveway. Most of the neighbors seemed friendly enough, polite waves and brief conversations about the weather. But the man who lived 2 houses down kept to himself. He wasn't unfriendly, but there was something about him that felt weird. I first noticed my neighbor's strange behavior about a week after I moved in. Every night around 11 p.m., he'd wheel a large trash can out to the curb, even if it wasn't trash day. He'd leave it there for a few minutes, then roll it back to his garage. At first, I chalked it up to some eccentric habit. Maybe he was cleaning his garage or sorting through old junk. But the more I watched, the stranger it seemed. He wasn't just taking out trash, he was carrying something heavy, wrapped in black plastic bags and carefully placing it into the bin. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. People do weird things and it wasn't my business. But one night, I couldn't help myself. I waited until he wheeled the bin back into his garage, then crept over to the curb to check. The inside of the bin was clean, spotless actually. It was too clean for someone who was supposedly tossing out garbage every night. A few days later, I decided to be friendly and introduce myself. When I knocked on his door, he seemed startled, like he wasn't expecting anyone. He was polite but evasive, quickly brushing me off and shutting the door. I caught a glimpse of his garage behind him, and what I saw gave me pause. Rows of large, identical plastic containers stacked neatly along the walls. That night, I heard the sound of something heavy being dragged across his driveway. It went on for nearly an hour. I stayed up listening, my mind racing with possibilities. The next morning, I noticed fresh dirt in his backyard, like he'd recently dug something up. I decided I didn't want to know what he was doing. About a month later, he moved out. A new family moved in shortly after, and I didn't think about him again until one day I saw police cars parked outside the house. Apparently, the new owners had found something buried in the backyard, several large bags filled with decayed animal remains. I'll never know why he was burying them, and honestly, I'm not sure I want to.